funny thing is that it wasn't even that important. Like, this NPC wasn't. I don't think he's important for the whole plot.
Okay, so he wasn't like the single prince or something like that.
Right? Yeah, but even if he was, I think like giving control over the character, especially to a player who's more experienced with the mechanics of the game, it will do some crazy stuff.
Sure. Manu, what does this say to you?
That you should be comfortable with people doing crazy stuff, right? I mean, if you're not, then it means you're trying to control things too much. I mean, that would be my first reaction.
The thing that interests me especially is that we can look at the two different techniques and they have the same lesson. Technique number one, permitting narration authority of a single outcome, which is just a little bit more consequential than just coloring it up, which is the head flying into the stew, right? I mean, she could have just said, oh, his head pops off, or she could have said, oh, there's green goo. She could have said, make it sound effects. Gunch, that's my favorite. But that really, all of that is just coloring up the die roll. Right. But and that's narration authority. But narration authority can have more weight. No pun intended. The zombie head could actually, with some weight, splash into the stew. And so, so that's the technique involved is the transfer of narration authority out of your hands as the game master. And then over here, it's a with Alexander's point. It's actually a somewhat more profound shift of authorities, isn't it? A somewhat more profound. It's somewhere, but I mean, it seems more profound, but really, it's not that awful. I mean, the dude at the table is perfectly capable of playing a character, right?
Yeah, and
I didn't. Right.
I wasn't thinking about this as something like vital.
Right.
Like, it was like. So one thing was that this NPC was a prisoner. He was on one hit point, but later when someone else's character fall down, I told him that if he wants, he can control some goblins, which would be an even enemy.
Even more fun. Yeah, even more.
Why
you have
not?
More agents going in different. Different priorities, different directions.
And I think, one thing about this is that I think some people don't have trust in other people at the table. Like, if I wouldn't have trust in those guys, I wouldn't play with them.
Right. Well, no, I'm with you on this. This is it's kind of like, well, that would only work if you have good players. And my response to that is, didn't we start with that? Anyway, Zach, what were you going to say?
I think and you can smack me on the head if this is too much big model stuff for today, but like, it just seems to me that what I'm hearing everybody talk about, Manu said, well, I need to be comfortable letting go of control. And I don't think the issue is always that the GM is somehow self-selects for control freaks, which maybe it does. And they need to, they must own the game. I think there's oftentimes a very real fear that if somebody is not at every point reorienting us back to what we're doing, that what we're doing will become incoherent a lot of times.
Right, the risk of chaos. The lurking chaos is always right at the door.
And I think that is more, it's more at the door to the extent that we don't have a creative agenda, either implicit or explicit. It doesn't matter if it's explicit. Yeah. And so when you don't have creative agenda, then you get all of these, you kind of get this vicious circle of play where the GM tries to make sure that it's about something, and players, I think even the most disruptive players, are actually relying on that, and they push really hard, but they push in a way that they know that he's going to put us back on track with what we're doing, and they're just trying to see if what they want to do is part of what the agenda is.
Right, exactly. They can say, if I'll give him this and he can run with it, and if he doesn't, then he's going to put me back anyway, right? So that's where you get a lot of this kind of thing where the player characters are glowering at each other and doing Cyclops and Wolverine at each other and stuff like that, perhaps. But one thing that I was interested in here is the fact that we can keep things not quite so formally empowered. I mean, you can have games where the game master does maintain all the narration authority. In playing the RuneQuest game that I'm playing, the game really gains nothing by transferring narration authority around the table. So it's just pretty much always comes back to me, and that's okay. I'll describe, how it turns out, how it looks. Similarly, you could have a game where we don't really know. Frankly, I don't really know what would happen in that RuneQuest game when and if one of the player characters bites the dust, which is miraculously has not happened because the game has many lethal, possibilities in its mechanics. Reading the rules and then saying you're going to play, 14 combat heavy sessions, which we've done, somebody's going to die. Somebody's not going to make it through a fight. And there have been many instances where the dice really did kind of, kind of look that way. And, then I look at my damage roll and sure enough, 2 1s and a 2 on 3d6. And I'm, sort of gaze at the players in shock and say, well, I guess it grazes your arm, or it has struck your chest, and only the point goes in a little bit. Your armor stops almost all of it. Take 1 point. Whereas I was certain that arrow with all that magic on it, with rolling 3d6, was going to punch right through them. So the point is that I don't know, frankly. I mean, you'd think that I would. What do I do when one of them dies? What's my rule? This is 1980, 1979 RuneQuest. You know what the response of those games was to when your character dies, right?
Roll a new one.
You
play the brother.
Yeah, well, at
or the
most,
cousin.
but especially for that session, I mean, that's it for you, right? And so, or, I'm sure in practice at the table, and I remember actually doing this way back in 1978 in junior high, at the table, sometimes, yes, indeed, you just say, okay, pick up the NPC. But of course, he was a faceless NPC. He was the NPC. But the thing with this situation, though, is let's keep it pretty close to home. Let's not have any of these weird techniques or sharings and stuff. Does that mean that I would be in control? And the answer is no. I would keep the narration authority, but I would use it just as pretty much as they did, right? I mean, to make things happen, but not necessarily to shift the backstory, shift the situation. All of a sudden, see, that's exactly what that guy was saying to do, right? In talking about taking over this NPC, make him less important, right? Make him, take away all the interesting stuff about him so the player can't have any of that. Do you see how he literally was changing the backstory? What you had in mind or knew, well, let's use the word, you knew, which says to say you had set for that NPC. Well, change that if it gets away from you somehow. If you were so foolish as to let it out of your hands, change it. So now that he has it, it's not so, doesn't have that kind of thing. And again, why? Because you'll be keeping the story safe. God knows what will happen if they, get their hands on consequential stuff. And so I agree that it's not necessarily a control freak thing, but I think it is a control freak thing in practice. It becomes, you have to turn yourself into that controller even if all you think you're doing is constructively keeping away chaos. I was thinking of something, though, which is, this is what I experience, and particularly if I was playing with younger people. And I hear this a lot when I talk about, or when I am talking about this stuff, and someone says, what if you're playing with someone new to role playing? What if you're playing with younger people?
Mm-hmm.
And this has gone all the way back to the origins of the hobby and a lot of my experiences a little after that. And the classic case is when somebody, and you'll excuse the genderizing of this because it was very consistent, the female romantic partner finally had been dragooned into playing. Right? I mean, there's some issue that she's not that happy that this guy spends all this time screwing around with his weird buddies, and their dice, and he spends too much money on it and all this stuff. And the guy says, just try it, right? And so she's kind of, all right. And of course he makes up the character for her, right? And all the rest of it. And of course, and I don't know how this happens, but it's like clockwork. Of course, the player is going to roll a fumble during the first fight. Of course. Something dreadful happens. They miss extravagantly. We were playing Rollmaster too, if you can believe it. So, of course, the fumble tables take her like all the way down into the depths of disaster, right? So you can see this. But that's one example that I'm thinking of. But there are lots of examples of this. And of course, this is an extreme point. There's ways that you can. I mean, this is what I saw in one case, is that the game master gleefully described all of the consequences, and I was watching the player's face just like turn from puzzlement to disappointment, and it just through several phases, all the way to just outright hatred for everybody there. The final phase was just pure raw hatred for all of us. And so, but to avoid that, then what do you do? I mean, again, the zombie, gets a massive damage roll on one of these poor players' hapless characters. And if you were playing with the five of us menu, you would happily describe how my character's arm is ripped out of their socket and the zombie, starts going, chewing on it and all the rest of it, right? And I'm like, ew, you bastard.
Yeah, but
do you really want to do that to your niece? Right? I mean, so, but how do you control the solution for me? Sorry, the solution for me is to choose what game you're playing, not to control it at the other end, right?
Right.
But anyway, Alexander, what did you have in mind? Sorry, what's that?
So it sucks. So what you're saying is basically that someone was dragging his or her girlfriend to the game, then pushes her to play, then didn't explain her what they're playing and why and what
could
might
happen, right? Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then was surprised when she was angry about what happened.
This was an intense learning experience for me, and fortunately, I was only a witness. Fortunately, I was not the perpetrator. I was the witness to this, and I remember it so well because the lesson sank in so hard that, don't do that is the only lesson. But yes, I think I've described it accurately, and I will not say that it was the origin of the eventual breakup of their marriage, but believe me, it was a chapter in that story.